Hi, this is Lainey Cameron. Today I'm here with Lauren Belfer, and we're going to be talking about Ashton Hall, which is really fascinating to me because as a Brit, it's set in Britain with a lot of history elements to it, an American coming to the UK, no less, but also it's like gothic and creepy. And I've been reading some of the reviews, and people are loving this book. I'm so excited to talk to you about it.
Well, I'm excited to be here, Lainey. Thank you so much for having me.
And where are you joining me from today?
I'm joining you from my office in my apartment in New York City in the Greenwich Village neighborhood.
So let's start with a bit about the new book. First off, if folks don't know you, you're a New York Times best-selling author. This is not your first time around the block with this book. You've won several prizes, big awards that really impress me. And this is your latest foray into a book that is set in modern times, which is a little bit different, right? So tell us more about the book.
So the book weaves together many different themes, but it begins when an almost 40-year-old American woman, Hannah Larson, goes to England with her 9-year-old son, Nicky, and they go there to care for an ill relative who's renting an apartment at a stately home, the Ashton Hall of the title. And little Nicky is neurodivergent. And soon after they arrive, he goes exploring in a deserted wing of the house and discovers a secret from the past, a secret that he and his mother will unravel through the course of the novel. But Ashton Hall is set in the present, as you say, while being couched in a historical setting. And it touches on themes of motherhood, marriage, sexual identity, and neurodiversity.
I was reading the reviews and how well people were reacting to different parts of this and making that little boy, it's a boy, right? Nicky,
Yes.
neurodivergent. Like, tell me more about that decision because it seems like it's so pivotal to the book. Like, what led you there? What was your inspiration for doing that?
My husband and I both have in our families um, more than one child who is neurodivergent. And it struck me that many families have children who are neurodivergent, and the issues involved are so seldom explored in fiction, and very seldom explored from the parent's perspective. And I tried to show in the book um, the very special joys and rewards, as well as some of the challenges of raising neurodivergent children. Nicky, I think, is such a character. I mean, to me, he's the hero of the book. Um, he has his areas of difficulty and struggle, yes, but he has such a joy about him. At least that's what I tried to give him, the great joy he takes in discovering things in the world around him, even though his mother often feels, he's going too far as he explores. But I really felt he is the hero of this book. And it meant a lot to me to explore the relationship between Nicky and his mother and the things she has to sacrifice to raise him. But as I say, the great joys of raising him also.
That's actually one of the reasons I was especially excited to have you on to talk about this book because we love to focus on the podcast on angles that aren't covered every day in women's fiction. And so I love when someone does this and puts a character in the book who isn't a character who is often shown. And so bravo, it's hard, it takes work, it takes research, and obviously you've done it really well because the reviews, people are really appreciating that angle of the book.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been very moving to me uh, when I see reviews people write to see them zeroing in on this relationship between Nicky and Hannah and being moved by the character of Nicky. Um, Sometimes he does things that he really should not do and it's hard being his mother, but Hannah loves him so, and that it's that I wanted to bring out the great love and as I said before, the joy and the struggle of raising him.
And you have some phenomenal blurbs or endorsements for this book. I saw you got an endorsement from Fiona Davis, which is lovely. We had Fiona on the podcast before. And I especially loved the endorsement you got from Julie Clark, who's the author of The Last Flight, among other books. And I loved how Julie Clark said that it's got Daphne du Maurier meets Kate Morton vibes. The setting, the skeleton, the mystery, the lovable characters. She called it an addictive read. Who doesn't want to be compared to Daphne du Maurier, for goodness sakes?
I was so touched and flattered and humbled all at once by what Julie said, because my publisher didn't ask her for a quote for the book. I was just going through my Instagram one day and I found that she had said that to, I don't know, some
What a,
question she had been asked, what are you reading, and that was her response. And um, I love her
what a
work.
gift.
So it was just one of those serendipitous things that come along. And all of the quotes, I mean, Fiona's quote, when terrific writers you admire take the time to comment on your work, it's very moving.
Right. Fiona called it captivating, which interestingly is a very common word in the reviews. I got a little post it here of the most common words that show up in your reviews, and captivating, engrossing, and immersive are the words that keep showing up again and again. So let's talk about your inspiration. Can you share anything with us about where the idea for this one came from?
Yes, so surprisingly, I think I first got the idea for Ashton Hall decades ago, when I was invited to stay at a stately home in the apartment that an acquaintance was renting, at Blickling Hall in Norfolk. That's a National Trust home. Um, I had never known that many of the National Trust homes rent out apartments, but they do. Apparently, it's a way to, well, raise money for the upkeep, and also to make sure that these stately homes um, continue to be homes and don't just turn into museums. So I went with fantastic excitement, went over to England and went to Blickling Hall, to this beautiful apartment my acquaintance was renting. And after the public rooms of the house closed for the day, I was free to wander through the historic rooms of Blickling, which was quite an experience, I have to say, and a little scary too. And I was able to walk up the back stairs and go into the attics, walk through deserted corridors, and yeah, I
Please,
started
please
getting
tell me you
ideas.
didn't find any skeletons in the walls while you were there.
No, but I kept
Okay.
expecting to. So that's why the idea for this novel, came to me when I was wandering through those attics and back corridors, and I made some notes for it. But I didn't begin writing at that then. I just kind of put it aside. Um, and I think I put it aside in retrospect because maybe I wasn't ready to write that yet. And it wasn't until years later, when my son was grown up and my husband was invited to be a visiting fellow at an institute at Cambridge University, and we went to live in England for a semester. It wasn't until then that I remembered my time at Blickling and the notes that I had made so long ago, and I brought them out. And it was then that I started working on the novel, then with the perspective of having raised a child and, being married. So I was finally ready to start work on it. And I'd already published 3 books by then.
Well, I think there's a fascinating lesson there for aspiring authors or those who are earlier in their career about taking notes, which I think is interesting. One of the questions I love to ask is what your edit process looks like for a book like this. And I have kind of a two-part question here for you, because you have been so successful. I mean, the awards you've won just, amazed and put me in awe. And so I'm interested in, what is your edit process, and has it changed from when you started?
I've worked the same way through all the novels, which is that I like to work fairly quickly in the first draft and get through to the end. And I learned that when I was working on my first book, City of Light, because I didn't really understand what the book was about until I finished it. And then I could see how all the threads came together. And that taught me that, for me at least, and every writer works differently, but for me, I like to get all my thoughts down on paper. I mean, I do make a rough outline before I start, and I always like to know where a book is going to end. Usually, I put the outline away in the drawer and seldom refer to it while I'm actually writing. But I feel this drive to get through to the end. And then, in a sense, the real work begins, because then I go back and I make another draft and another. I mean, sometimes 5 or 6 full drafts before I show it to my agent, who will then come back with, notes and suggestions. And then an editor, of course, we work very. I was blessed with an extraordinary editor on this book, Susanna Porter, and we worked very closely together. And she had wonderful insights and ideas. And I think a good editor like Susanna is always concerned with making the book more of what it already is. Not making it veer off into some new direction, but making the themes that are already there stronger and clearer. Like many books, this book had to be cut before it was ready for publication. It was long. And most of what was cut had to do with English food and with dogs. And um, when my editor went through it, I often found these comments, too much dog, too much food. Why so many meals? Um, it's just very funny to me. And I loved exploring English food when I was living in England. And so I wove a lot of English meals into the manuscript. And one of the main characters of the book is a golden retriever named Duncan, who is based on my own dear golden retriever, Jasper. I changed Jasper's name to Duncan to protect Jasper's privacy. And I think in retrospect, I hated to lose some of the English food, and I hated to lose some of Duncan and Duncan's dog friends in the book. But now, when I reread the finished version of the book, I realize there's still a lot of food and still a lot of dog. But it's
It's
funny,
funny,
you
we
don't
don't
think
see it
it
in
till
our own writing. Yeah, exactly.
right.
So, like I said, you've won these awards. I'm looking at a little list here: the Washington Post Best Novel, NPR Best Mystery of the Year, New York Times Notable Book. You've been a New York Times bestseller. I mean, goodness, for all the aspiring authors who are looking at you, Lauren, going like, how do I become that someday? Tell us a little bit about what advice you give.
First, I want to say that it never gets easier. I mean, one would hope that, like, this is my fourth novel, that this would have been easier to write than my first novel. But it was just as hard, if not harder, because you're starting something new and you don't know these characters and you don't know the world that they live in. Um, but I will say, the two pieces of advice that I have for writers who are just starting out. The most common thing you hear, the sort of stereotypical advice for writers, is write what you know. And it seems to me that it's better to write what you don't know, but want to find out about. And when I was just starting out, I spent a lot of time writing stories about what I knew. And I was never really felt excited about it, or never really felt I was going anywhere with it. And it wasn't until I realized that I could write historical fiction, which had never occurred to me until I was, in my early 30s. It just never occurred to me, even though I loved historical novels. I don't know what I was thinking. Um, that I would read historical novels, but then didn't think I could write one. But when I realized that, yes, I could do that, then my work really seemed to open up. Because then I was exploring new things that I wanted to learn about, and I could bring that excitement into the work. And it's not as if then you just forget about your own life and your own concerns. but you just weave them together in a different way. So, if say my
That,
first novel, which takes place in Buffalo in 1901, um, the moral issues in that book and the issues that the characters struggle with, those are issues that are very important to me. But I've created around them a setting that I
and
feel
what's
very
give folks the
excited.
name of that one, just in case they haven't read it?
City of Light. It's called City of Light, and it's about my hometown of Buffalo, New York in 1901. And you don't usually think of Buffalo, New York as the City of Light, but in fact, that's what it was called in 1901 for reasons that people can read the book to find out about.
And
And then,
I'll put the link to that and all of the books that we mentioned in the show notes on the website. So if you go to
oh,
the episode page at Best of Women's Fiction, you can get to all of the books we talk about.
oh, thank you. And then the second piece of advice I have is never give up. So the first short story of mine that was ever published was rejected 43 times before it found an editor who loved it. Now this was in the days before self-publishing, because I probably would have gone that route long before if that had been an option, but it wasn't an option. And those were also the days when you were supposed to send things out one at a time. So you print it out, mail it in, wait for the mailing to come back, as it always seemed to do, 10, 15, 20, all the way up to 43 rejections. And then when that finally came back with a note from an editor who wanted to accept it, I thought to myself, gee, don't you know that all your peers have rejected this? Why are you accepting it? But that was the thing. For him, it was as if he had never read it before. As if he was the first editor reading it. And apparently he loved it. And that was really shocking to me after all these rejections. But he was the editor of a fairly prestigious journal. And that really taught me something, just to keep going, that if you believe in the work, you think it's the best you can do, just keep going out there with it. And the second short story of mine to be published was much more successful. It was rejected only 27 times. So I felt vindicated after those 27 rejections. So, to just keep
And
going. And when I was ready to publish my first novel, several agents rejected the book. And one agent wanted a complete rewrite. She said, well, I see you've done a lot of work, so here are my notes on what you should do. And that rewrite would have destroyed the novel. So again, I had to stick with what I felt was right and go on to find an agent who loved the book. And she also had suggestions, but they were suggestions that felt right in my heart. And this is an important thing, I think, too, that agents and editors, they all have an idea of where a book could go and what it should be. And I think their opinions, as a writer, you should respect their opinions, but you also have to know when those opinions feel right to you, when they feel in your own heart, you say, oh, yes, that's right. That's what I should do. And if you wind up thinking, well, that doesn't sound right to me, but I'm going to do it anyway, because then maybe this agent will represent me, the work is going to be false then. And I
right.
guess I've been lucky enough along the way to find an agent and find, editors um, who are kind of on the same page that I'm on. And so all of their suggestions make the book more of what I want it to be. I know I keep referring to it that way, but that's really what it is, that you want it to be more of your original conception of it, not pushed into some area
I
that
think
then you
that's really important. Like what you're, yeah, the idea of having a creative vision for what you're trying to bring into the world. And if someone's feedback helps improve on that creative vision and helps you meet that creative vision, great. But if they're suggesting a different creative vision of what they imagine the book should be, then they're not your partner. They're not the person to partner with. I talk to other writers about this a lot. Like their opinion might be perfectly valid, but it doesn't mean it's what you wanted to do with that book, in which case it's not helpful and toss it away.
Well, that's right. And you are also the one who goes out into the world as the face of that book.
So let's talk about books, because I know you're an avid reader, and I would love to hear, like, what would you recommend people have a read at that perhaps you've read yourself recently?
So I've just finished reading Horse by Geraldine Brooks. And this is a book that has several narratives. It goes back and forth in time. One of the primary narrative strains in it is the legacy of racial discrimination in America. And it focuses on the Black horse trainers before the Civil War, most of them enslaved. And this was a story I had never known about in any way, shape, or form. And Geraldine Brooks makes this story absolutely riveting. Um, I will say that I don't know anything about horses, and I didn't really think I cared about horses until I read this book. And I just couldn't put it down. She just makes you care so much about the people in the book, and about the horses too. Um, I'm also reading The Matchmaker's Gift by Linda Cohen Leugman. Linda's been a guest here on the podcast. And The Matchmaker's Gift is just a magical book. I learned so much from it. Again, it goes back and forth in time. It's about a woman matchmaker in the early part of the 20th century here in New York, and about her granddaughter, who's an attorney. Um, and I don't want to give too much away about it, of course, but it has this. It's magical to read, and it also has a touch of magic in it. And usually, I don't really like magical realism. I'm very much of a um, present, rational, real life. But the magical part of this book is so beautiful. It just really drew me in, and I wanted to believe it. And another book I'm about to start, I'm really interested in, is called The Thread Collectors. And that's by Shauna Edwards and Allison Richmond. And they've written that as a team. It's about a Black woman in New Orleans during the Civil War and a white Jewish woman in New York City during the Civil War, and their paths cross. And the story is loosely based on Shauna and Allison's own family history. And it provides a perspective on the Civil War that I didn't know anything about. I mean, to hear the perspective of Black people, of Black enslaved people, and it's very difficult to learn about these things. It's a part of American history that's not usually touched on by the descendants of the people who experienced these things. And I think it's really important. So I'm really looking forward to immersing myself in The Thread Collectors.
I think I'm going to go seek that one out based on what you've said so far and earlier about that one. It sounds like exactly the kind of untold story that gets me really excited.
Yes,
And
thank
so we're
you.
almost at the end of our time here. But is there anything I missed or didn't ask you, or that you didn't get to cover, that you wanted to make sure you said during our talk here?
I always like to talk for a minute about why I designed the research in the novel the way I did. Um, the character of Hannah Larson recreates a family from the Tudor era, and she recreates them by looking at their account ledgers, and so the records of things they bought, and also at their library registers, so lists of things they checked out of the library. And the idea of unraveling these lives from the past in this way um, feels very close to me, because I started thinking about those issues when I was researching my own family history. Um, my family came from Eastern Europe, and many members of my family were uh, caught up in the Holocaust and murdered in Europe during the Holocaust. And when I went back and tried to find the town that they were from and find anything I could about their lives, I started reading business directories and looking at old documents and trying to find birth records and death records. And I started to think, well, what would historians of the future find about me if they began looking at my life? And what with so much being online now and there not being physical letters that people exchange. And I thought, well, people would have financial records, my credit card bills, my um, bank statements, tax returns, and they would have library records. Because I've been an avid reader since I was very young. And I thought, well, if someone had a list of all the books I've checked out of all the libraries wherever I've lived since I was a little girl, they would know a lot about me, probably more than I would ever want them to know because of
And
some of the things
possibly
I,
more than you know about yourself. I'm thinking about,
well,
like,
that's
it's an
right.
interesting lens on someone, right? Like, if we were to look at that list for ourselves, would it even show us the way we see ourselves? It's a
Well, that's
fascinating
right.
question.
And what we were interested in when we were 15 and then 20 and 25 that we may today have completely forgotten those passions that we once had. And so I thought, as I was contemplating how to write Ashton Hall, that I would use these two things, that I would allow Hannah in the novel to use these account ledgers and see how she could recreate the family based on the tapestries they put on their walls and the velvet nightcaps that they wore to bed. And I based all of this on Tudor era account ledgers that I found. And then
That's
I
beautiful.
created a library register for them, lists of books that they checked out of their family library. And all of the books there are actual books that existed in the Tudor era. Even though the family in the novel is fictional, I got it into my head that all those books had to be real, actual books that they could have read. And that took a lot of
Wow.
research, but
That
it made it
sounds like a
alive
ton of
for me.
research.
And when I think about the novel, when I reread it now, I feel those people coming alive in my mind based on these things that they bought and these books that they read. And that's kind of cool for me. I I just hope
That's
that
awesome.
readers would feel the same as they read the book.
And if folks want to follow you, connect with you, hear other interviews you do, what's the best place? Where do you share the most? Where do you most hang out online?
Of mostly on Instagram. So at Lauren Belfer one on Instagram, and then second on Facebook, author Lauren Belfer on Facebook, and a little bit on Twitter, but that's not really where I go. And then my website always has updates on what I'm doing, laurenbelfer.com.
Awesome. I'll put all those links on the episode page at bestofwomensfiction.com. And I just want to say thank you for writing such a beautiful book, which took so much effort. I can tell from your passion the amount of research that went into it as well. And I'm so glad we got to have you here on the podcast. Thanks for joining me, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Lainey. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thanks for the great questions.